Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sarah Sega with the National Center on Improving Literacy. I'd like to welcome you. Our Reading the Room series centers on discussions with researchers, practitioners, and community members on the science of reading, evidence-based literacy instruction, and related policies that affect students and teachers. We're pleased to share this event with you focused on research findings on intervention for students with or at risk for dyslexia. Today, the panelists will discuss findings of a recent meta-analysis involving studies conducted over the last 4 decades that aim to improve reading outcomes for grade K through 5 students with or at risk for dyslexia, and share their perspectives on the factors and characteristics which are consistently associated with effective interventions and outcomes, including for students who are English learners. If you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A feature. And we will have a dedicated Q&A time at the end, as time permits, to share some of those questions with our panelists to answer. This time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hank Feen, Director of NCIL, who will provide a brief overview of that center and introduce today's moderator.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. We're very excited for our all-star cast in our Reading the Room series. I'm a professor of special education at Boston University, Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, and also direct the National Center on Improving Literacy, funded through the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education and managed by OSEP, and put in the ESSA legislation. I'm going to do a short description of what our partners and what NCIL is charged with. Boston University is the prime, and we have substantive partnerships with the Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University and the University of Oregon and RMC Research Corp, and other universities like the University of Virginia and a bunch of other partners across the country. So in the legislation, our primary charge is to increase access to and use of evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and teach students with literacy-related disabilities, including dyslexia. So there's 2 primary things that we're trying to accomplish: both provide knowledge and information about the evidence base, but also provide tools and technologies for the implementation of that evidence base. Our first priority is to identify or develop low-cost evidence-based assessment tools for identifying students at risk of either reading difficulties, including dyslexia. Our second priority is to identify evidence-based literacy instruction, strategies, accommodations, and interventions to support the growth of students with and at risk for reading disabilities, including dyslexia. Our third priority is to translate the research base for parents and families of students with disabilities with information, and collaborate with other OSEP-funded parent training centers. Our fourth priority is to identify or develop evidence-based professional development for teachers, paraprofessionals, principals, and other educators on the evidence base through technical assistance. And our final priority is to disseminate those products through our website, through social media, and through events like this. Our Reading the Room series would be a priority 5 activity. So I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing not only my colleague, Dr. Nancy Nelson, but my spouse, Dr. Nancy Nelson Feen is a Deputy Director of NCIL, and she also leads the Instruction and Intervention strand. And she's also the Director for the Lead for Literacy Center. She's an Assistant Professor of Special Education in Boston University's Wheelock College. She has more than a decade of experience in leading federally funded research projects and providing technical assistance to states and local to districts. Dr. Nelson's work focuses on developing and evaluating reading and mathematics interventions for students with or at risk for learning disabilities, the use of assessments in school settings, and the implementation of multi-tier systems of support, MTSS, to support diverse learners. She's a nationally certified school psychologist and a former middle school and high school special education teacher. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy, who will moderate the rest of the session today.
Thank you, Hank. It's great to be here discussing this important topic, and I hope you benefit from the discussion as much as I know I will today. I'd like to begin today's discussion by introducing our accomplished and knowledgeable panelists. So Dr. Colby Hall is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum Instruction and Special Education at the University of Virginia. Dr. Hall studies literacy development, assessment, and instruction. Her research focuses on the components of effective literacy instruction for elementary and middle school students with or at risk for literacy learning difficulties. In particular, she is interested in reading instruction for emergent bilingual students with reading difficulties, instruction supporting text comprehension in content area classrooms, and technology-delivered reading instruction. Dr. Hall is currently co-PI of an Institute of Education Sciences funded project that aims to further develop and pilot a kindergarten literacy intervention program. She is also co-PI of a Virginia Department of Education funded project working with co-panelist and PI Dr. Emily Solari that seeks to revise the English language state literacy screener and newly develop a Spanish language literacy screener. Dr. Hall is also co-investigator of an Office of Special Education Programs funded project that provides school leaders with web-based coaching to support teachers in delivering evidence-based academic vocabulary instruction. Welcome, Colby. Dr. Sharon Vaughn is the Manuel J. Justiz Endowed Chair in Education and the Executive Director of the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk, an organized research unit that she founded with a Make-A-Wish gift from the Meadows Foundation family. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Distinguished Faculty and Research Award, the CEC Research Award, and the AERA SIG Distinguished Researcher Award, and the Jeanette E. Fleischner Award. Dr. Vaughn is the author of more than 40 books and 350 research articles, 6 of which have met the What Works Clearinghouse criteria for their intervention reports. Thank you, Sharon, for being here. Dr. Emily Solari is the coordinator of and professor in the Reading Education Program in the University of Virginia's Department of Curriculum Instruction and Special Education. Her work has included intervention development and trials with students who have early profiles of reading difficulties, individuals diagnosed with autism, and English language learners. She is particularly focused on translating the science of reading by engaging with practitioners and policymakers to leverage scientific evidence to improve practice in school settings. The goal of her scholarship is to develop and test the efficacy of targeted interventions to prevent and ameliorate reading difficulties. Dr. Solari is PI of 2 U.S. Department of Education funded grants, directs the Virginia Literacy Partnerships, and is editor-in-chief of the Reading League Journal. Thank you, Emily, for being here. It's great to have all 3 of you. You can, in the audience, you can tell the expertise that we have to bring to bear for this discussion today, which will focus first and foremost on a recent systematic review and meta-analysis led by Dr. Hall. We will also talk more broadly about the implications of this work for reading instruction and intervention for students with or at risk for disabilities. So I'm going to start there with the systematic review and meta-analysis. And I want to describe for the audience very briefly how a systematic review and meta-analysis are different from other types of research that you might read about. Essentially, a systematic review is an approach to summarizing research findings from other research studies following a systematic process and pre-established decision rules to rigorously collate the findings of those research studies to report to the field on effective practice. A meta-analysis takes a systematic review one step further by pooling the effect sizes produced in the research studies to communicate the average effect of an intervention under certain conditions. So that is what has been conducted. And Dr. Hall, will start with you to get some information about the meta-analysis and systematic review. What is it study and why was there a need for it at this time?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of other rigorous meta-analyses of reading intervention research. So that's a really important question. Why another? Why is there a need for one more? And the reason that we thought there was a need is that previous meta-analyses of reading intervention research have used a pretty broad definition of reading difficulties or risk for reading difficulties. In many cases, risk could be indicated by coming from a low-income family. There were also just a broad range of reading and language difficulties that would be included. I'm just looking at some of the criteria used in previous metas, and yeah, sort of language disorders. In the lowest 30 3% of their classes and reading below grade level, that sort of thing. And we were interested in learning more about the evidence base for a subset of those kids with or at risk for word reading difficulties in particular. And the way that we defined it, it's sort of important to define dyslexia in the context of this meta. So we said that we would only include studies that used a screening threshold of performance at or below the 25th percentile on a norm referenced measure of word reading, spelling, or skills foundational to word reading or spelling. Or students had reported mean performance at baseline at the 16th percentile on a norm referenced measure of word reading or spelling or measure, constructs foundational to word reading or spelling. So that was our definition of being at risk for dyslexia in this study. And it's important because not everyone defines dyslexia in that way, but that's what we did. So yeah, I think that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, it is. That's great. I appreciate also you clarifying that the focus is on students with dyslexia as you defined dyslexia, which has implications for the review itself in terms of what you describe and what the features of the interventions will be that you will talk about as we engage in further discussion. So from the meta-analysis, what were the primary findings that came out of that?
Yeah, so the biggest finding is that reading interventions that have been evaluated in rigorous research, and I say rigorous research because the inclusion criteria that we used did mean that we included studies that used rigorous experimental designs, used norm referenced measures, that sort of thing. So in reading interventions out there that have been evaluated with students with or at risk for dyslexia, on average, there are significant positive effects in favor of reading intervention. The mean effect was 0.33, which is, in the context of other reading intervention research, it's a meaningful effect on student reading outcomes. So that was the big finding. And then there are some other findings too. One is that all of the interventions did include a word reading instructional component. Many of them included other components as well. I think about half of them also had some sort of a meaning focused component, as well as having a component that focused on foundational skills. What else? There were some not many statistically significant moderators of intervention effects, but dosage was a statistically significant moderator. So on average, if you gave students more of an intervention, each hour more of an intervention was associated with a slight increase in the effect of the intervention. So that was an important finding. We did look at whether intervention components were associated with improvement, like if including a spelling component in addition to a word reading component made an intervention more effective. And we didn't find in this sort of more rigorous multiple moderator model, we didn't find that there were statistically significant effects of, well, the three things we looked at. One was including a spelling component in addition to a word reading component. One was including PA instruction as kind of a standalone component in addition to word reading instruction. And the other was including morphology and or vocabulary instruction in addition to word reading instruction. And in the multiple moderator model, there were no statistically significant effects of those variables, and maybe this is too technical, but in the single moderator model, adding spelling instruction to word reading instruction was associated with positive effects. So, and for reasons related to power, I think we can say that there was a little bit of a trend that emerged in the single moderator model that maybe wasn't able to emerge in the multiple moderator model. There's sort of potentially emerging evidence that spelling instruction combined with word reading instruction could be associated with bigger effects. And Russell Gersten in a previous meta for students in grades 1 through 3 with sort of a broader range of reading difficulties did find that to be the case as well. So I think it's worth noting that. Maybe the one other interesting finding that I'll note, there were a few other ones, but maybe we can get to that later. Multisensory reading interventions, and we defined those as interventions that marketed themselves as multisensory. They sort of were self-described as multisensory. Were not more effective than interventions that didn't describe themselves as multisensory. And what the effects of one-on-one intervention didn't meaningfully differ from small group intervention.
Those are some fantastic findings that definitely have implications for the way that we think about reading instruction and intervention for students. I'd like to talk about some of those implications. So what are the implications of the review for school staff and others who might be interested in interventions for students with or at risk for dyslexia? So this is still focused on the article a bit, but a little bit more broad. I know, Emily, you're a co-author on the article, and Sharon, you have a wealth of expertise related to these topics. So I'd love to have the three of you discuss some of those implications that can be taken away from this article and your work.
Yeah, go ahead and start, Emily, and then I can jump in.
Yeah, I think maybe a way to sort of simply say it is we know that explicit and systematic instruction is essential, and it's a critical component of early reading instruction. And the other thing that I think about a lot is dosage. And so when I think about that, what I'm thinking about is there are kids in schools who, even if they get the best core instruction that's explicit and systematic and does everything that we would want, everything that we would want in a curriculum, in a core curriculum, some kids still just need more dosage, and that's just the way it is and the way it's going to be. And so we really need to think about how we provide wraparound supports for those kids. So they need really, really good core instruction and appropriately dosaged tier 2 or tier 3, whatever we're calling it. So supplemental or more intensive instruction. And that instruction needs to be explicit and systematic and follow a reasonable scope and sequence. So that kids are getting adequate instruction. And the other thing that we know that's important from other studies, and I think Sharon's been involved in some of this work, and I have as well, is kids need to have ample opportunities to respond with appropriate feedback and scaffolding. So a part of that explicit and systematic approach includes opportunities to respond and appropriate scaffolding from a teacher. I'll let Sharon add on.
Yeah, no, thanks, Emily. That's really helpful. And sort of piling on to what she just said, a couple of things struck me when I reread what I think is an outstanding meta-analysis. Thank you, Colby and Emily, for leading it. Is that a lot of the studies were kindergarten and first grade, and not all of them, but the vast majority. And so as we think about what we know about word reading disabilities, AKA dyslexia, we are sort of constrained by students who are very beginning readers. And so I think we need to kind of think a little more about why it is we have so few studies in 4th and 5th grade. I mean, I don't know, were there even a handful? And then secondly, whether or not we would want to generalize these findings to that group. And so it's just something to think about. Secondly, a big idea that I took away was, I think we have under discussed, we have these big 5 ideas of reading that everybody talks about with, science of reading, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. But we've really neglected the 6th big idea, which is the reciprocity between writing and reading. And especially the way this manifests in this synthesis is around spelling, and the way in which sort of writing words and learning the orthography that connects with the phonology and really getting kids to see that, especially in a very opaque linguistic structure like English, where spellings and phonology are so disconnected. And so I just think we need to kind of emphasize more the role of spelling/writing in reading, because I think this finding is becoming more and more consistent. So I'm just wondering what you all think about whether you would generalize the findings to older students with dyslexia from this synthesis, and maybe what you think we know about that group.
I think that is such a good point. And to answer your question, there were 8 of the studies were with students in grades 3 through 5, 45 of them were with students in grades K through 2, and 304 of the effect sizes were with students in grades K through 2, only 47 were with students in grades 3 through 5. So we did do a moderate, we looked to see if the effects of interventions for students in grades K through 2 differed from interventions tested with students in 3 through 5. And theoretically, we found that there were no statistically significant differences, but that was just because we had so little power to discover differences because there were so few studies done with older students. Descriptively, we can say that the effect sizes achieved with older students were a lot smaller than the effects achieved with younger students. Descriptively, it's 0.6 associated with students in grades 3 through 5 and 0.36 for younger students in K through 2. But also, as you say, Sharon, like I do think that, really these findings and sort of the generalizations that I'm talking about, we can say we feel confident they apply to students in K through 2, but there really isn't enough evidence. There just, there aren't enough studies with older kids in this meta-analysis to really say we know what works for students in grades 3 through 5, or we know that what has been tried, works, I guess.
So thinking about all of that and then thinking about trying to inform the field from this work, what are your recommendations that you would walk away from this work and provide to teachers who are working in a K-5 context related to K2, where there's more evidence for what they should be doing in terms of practice, but also in grades 3 through 5, where maybe there's less evidence about what should happen, but in the absence of that evidence, trying to still provide the best instruction for students with dyslexia, and also recognizing we're talking about a meta-analysis and systematic review that looked at effectiveness of practices for students with dyslexia. So we're focused more narrowly on word level reading instruction with some integration of spelling, to Sharon's point, but also then recognizing as students get older, there are secondary effects of dyslexia, and we want to think about those secondary effects that might affect comprehension development. So throwing that back to you, from this, what would you recommend to educators?
Like Sharon is the person to answer this question, especially because she's conducted a lot of research with that upper elementary age group recently, or, across her career, but also recently.
Yeah. Thanks for giving me this tough question. So here's what I'll say I think we know, but here's what I think we don't know. And that part of the conversation might be a little too long. So here's what I think we know. I think we know that as we think about students in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, my understanding is one of the reasons those effect sizes are so much smaller is that because by the time you're in 4th grade, if you continue to have a persistent word reading problem, this intractability of the word reading problem is probably a distinct group. So if we look at the K1 students, these are students who may be having word reading problems for a lot of reasons that could be more readily remediated. So readily remediated students exist in abundance in K1, a little less so in 2nd grade, and not very much at all in 3rd through 5th grade. So we should not be surprised by these smaller impact scores. Secondly, as we get to older students, we really start having comprehension depend more on vocabulary and background knowledge. So, when you're in 1st grade, like, what do you need to know in order to know, the boy has a hat, it was blue. I mean, the amount of background knowledge you need to read these stories is pretty thin. But the kind of background knowledge you need when you get into 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and the kind of vocabulary you need is much more intense. So we know we've got those 2 issues, and they're not small. And so in my mind, so that's kind of what we know. So what do we not know? How do we do something about this? So, I don't want to, we could do a whole thing about vocabulary and how people teach it wrong, but I'm going to pile on and say, we can't teach vocabulary word by word. These kids need 10,000 words a year, not 10. So we've got to have mechanisms that make vocabulary learning generative. Secondly, we have to have ways to sort of backfill some of this knowledge gap. And I know that's kind of a popular topic right now, but I don't think it's a whimsical topic. I think it's a gritty topic. Actually, the people at UVA, you started all this like 20 years ago. Do you remember that? You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yeah, Hirsch and
Okay. Okay, so I'll just pause because I kind of gave you what I think we know and what I think we don't know. And then maybe Colby or Emily or someone will pick up from there.
I appreciate, when I talk about this stuff, I always talk about, we need to tell people what we know and what we don't know. And perhaps what we don't know is the more important thing to communicate to the field, because I think that there's sort of this big box of things that are being seen as evidence-based and may not be. And so communicating what is evidence-based and what is not is really important. The other thing is, I think we have a tendency in schools sometimes to, when a kid is identified as having a reading difficulty or has dyslexia, that this all of a sudden becomes somebody else's issue to deal with outside of the general education teacher. And when we think about dosage and how important multiple exposures to content is, we really can't be thinking about it that way, especially as kids get older. So these kids need really good core and more. And so that means that is the responsibility of the general education teacher and perhaps a reading specialist and perhaps a special education teacher, all working together to make sure that the child is getting aligned instruction, and also that the dosage is appropriate. I can't say that enough, because we cannot, for some of these kids, think that core instruction is enough. But we also, on the flip, can't think, because this child has been identified, it's no longer my problem in the general education setting, because a lot of that rich conversation around language and oral language development should be happening in the core. So I'll let Colby comment if you want to.
Yeah, I think I just want to reiterate what you both have said, that first of all, there is a need for more research with older students, because it is possible that older students with dyslexia need something a little different from students in K-2 with dyslexia, and we don't totally know what they need. I think it's likely that they do need more meaning-focused instruction than younger students may need. And I do think one other thing to point out that is at least tangentially connected to this question is that our findings and the studies that we included in this meta were actually really similar to findings that have been reported in, the 7 previous meta-analyses that I describe in the introduction to the paper. They were multi-component interventions that addressed foundational skills as well as meaning. They really, on average, the effect of 0.33 was almost identical to the mean effect found in previous meta-analyses of research. And part of what it made me and Emily and other authors, but I'll let Emily speak for herself, think when we were reviewing our findings is that, it's just really important to acknowledge that students with dyslexia, according to our definition, many of them, the majority of them, research shows that they have difficulties with word reading, but they also have difficulties, some of which are secondary symptoms, but also, sometimes emerge simultaneously with these word reading difficulties in language, with language comprehension. So I don't know exactly where I was going with that point there, but I think it's really important that we conduct more research. It's also probably really important that we acknowledge, even though this was a research question worth asking, it's this group of students with dyslexia, very often they do have difficulties in other literacy domains as well.
Sounds like you're saying to some degree, the one potential takeaway of this work is that the type of interventions that are effective for students with or at risk for dyslexia are beneficial to students sort of as a whole. And as we think about comprehensive reading instruction in core instruction, general education, to Emily's point, where many students with or at risk for dyslexia are served, needs to be comprehensive for that reason. So although when we're talking about dyslexia, we are very much focused on foundational reading skills, sort of instruction, word level instruction, decoding, spelling, we also need to be thinking more broadly about the reading difficulties a student might be having or the reading instruction a student needs to make sure everyone is getting what they need.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, Nancy, I want to address one of the issues that came up in the chat because I've had a chance to look at the issue about multisensory instruction and whether it really has beneficial outcomes that are greater impact than other interventions. So there's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, I appreciate that multisensory gets described and defined differently by different people. And so when someone does a meta-analysis like this, or meta-analyses I've participated in, we are reliant on the author's description of their multisensory program. So in other words, we didn't do the study, so we don't know what it looked like and how well it was conducted, as we don't for anyone's study. We only know what they write about. But they identify the program as multisensory, so we have no choice but to accept it as true. So these are multisensory programs that have been identified by the researchers as multisensory. Secondly, they've been contrasted in two ways. They've been contrasted with other treatment programs. So in, for example, Colby and Emily's meta-analysis, they looked at a subset of the interventions, and I really have no right to be talking about their meta-analysis when they're here in front of me, but they can just stop me anytime and say wrong. But anyway, they looked at it, and what they found is it wasn't differentially effective. So it wasn't less effective than other interventions, but it also wasn't more effective. So the outcome doesn't mean under no circumstances should you use multisensory, but it also means you don't have a very strong position to stand in front of someone and say it's better. You'd have to think about that. And other meta-analyses have compared multisensory to other kinds of treatments. Sometimes they are stronger treatments or weaker treatments, we don't know, but compared to other treatments. And this finding has been relatively consistent. The one finding that is promising for multisensory is that multisensory, though not statistically significantly in terms of practical effects, does seem to be associated with greater impact with respect to decoding or word reading, but that has not been statistically significant. So that's a lot of words about multisensory, and I hope that sort of clarifies a little bit what we know about the multisensory interventions. And by the way, there hasn't been a lot of good research in that area. So I think it's a very promising area for future research. Would you add something to that, Emily or Colby, to sort of nuance that?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to point out that in the meta-analysis that we're talking about today, we did just define multisensory as a, if you marketed your program as multisensory, you were multisensory. And partly we did it that way because we know that there's been a lot of policy making recently that uses the term multisensory, that states have mandated that teachers be trained in approaches that are multisensory, or that the districts adopt programs that are multisensory. And we figured that in order to follow up on those policy mandates, stakeholders would need to choose a program that markets itself as multisensory. So we thought that there was some, it made sense in some ways to define our term in that way. But I will also share that I did a really small observation study a couple years ago that compared an approach to instruction that I was part of developing. I was on a team that was developing this approach to reading instruction. And then we compared it with another approach that was being used in schools called the multisensory teaching approach. So multisensory was in its name. And when we were coding for aspects of instruction that we considered might be multisensory, including manipulatives, sort of kinesthetic activities where you're using your arm to segment a word into phonemes, for example, like those sorts of things, we were really surprised to discover that the program that we had put together included more kind of quote unquote multisensory aspects, at least according to the coding scheme we used, than the one that described itself as the multisensory teaching approach. So, and there are people who, of course, define multisensory as just involving auditory and visual modalities. And I think almost all reading instruction involves auditory and visual modalities. I usually think of it as being sort of involving some kinesthetic aspect of instruction. And I think many people do think of multisensory in that way, like using shaving cream or, skywriting or, something that's using your body, right, in order to, so that was probably too long talking about the definition of multisensory, and I should instead talk about implications. I do think it's important to talk about because of these policy mandates. I think that Sharon's point about the fact that, at least in the study we're talking about today, we didn't find that multisensory instruction was less effective. We just didn't find evidence to support mandates that require folks to use multisensory approaches to instruction in place of approaches that are evidence-based, explicit, systematic approaches to instruction that are not multisensory.
That was going to be my follow-up
Yeah.
question.
Sorry, can I make a quick comment on that?
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, I think the descriptions, I think it's really clear we don't have an agreed upon definition of multisensory. And so that becomes problematic when people are doing all these meta-analysis and stuff like that. It also becomes really problematic in a policy space because we just don't have an agreed upon definition. But I think always coming back to what we know. So what does the evidence show us? And also thinking about what is happening in schools today, what is happening for kids, and thinking about teacher time. So teachers don't have a lot of time with kids to do intervention. They just really don't. And that's both in the core and, tier 2 and tier 3. And so I beg of teachers and interventionists and reading specialists and special educators to think about the best use of their instructional time. This is really, really important because dosage is so important. So explicit and systematic instruction, multiple opportunities to respond with appropriate scaffolding and feedback. And sometimes what you see when you go out is maybe too much attention to these, what we would consider these multisensory activities that are not explicit and systematic. And it's not, and they're not teachers, and we're not doing it because we're doing it because we think it's what we should be doing, but really we should probably dial back and think about what does the evidence really tell us and how can we appropriately use our instructional time.
So I'm going a little bit off script here, but this is something that came up earlier in conversation that I think also connects to some of the more recent points about curriculum and policy and some of the things that are happening in the field. And I was looking at the Knowledge Matters campaign website recently, where they have a list of programs that they say sort of teach knowledge, which is, again, obviously important for supporting students' broad reading proficiency, focus, their comprehension skills, their vocabulary knowledge, et cetera. What are your sort of takeaways or recommendations for folks who are looking at information like that, where in many cases, some of those programs might be strong on knowledge building, but might be weak in foundational reading skills, which we also know are important. What would you say to policymakers or educators trying to think about and grapple with these ideas of what curricula they can use to effectively teach students in elementary school?
So I'm going to be really bold and say something that I'm sure people are going to react to. So here's my bold statement. I think that Tier 1 has huge responsibility for all of the key components of reading, but even greater responsibility for vocabulary and background knowledge. I think that we have limited time in intervention, and because of that, we need to really laser focus on those priority skills for students that are necessarily taught in very small groups like 4 and smaller. And that includes more of the foundation skills and some of the more priority skills like text reading with support, etc. And so I would push a lot of the vocabulary building and background knowledge out of interventions because of time. And as Emily said, it is our most precious resource, and we simply have to allocate it wisely. So that's my thinking.
I think that's such a good point. And I don't know if I have anything profound to add to it, but I do think that sometimes those two goals of building knowledge and building, word reading skills are not as incompatible as they sometimes are made out to be. And so if you're an efficient teacher in sort of the way Emily was describing, where you're teaching with a really brisk pace and providing lots of opportunities to respond and minimizing teacher talk and engaging students in lots of accountable text reading, you really can work on and using like really sort of efficient error correction procedure, all of these things. If you're an efficient teacher, you really can achieve both of those goals simultaneously.
Emily, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the knowledge campaign stuff is really very important. There's just no reason why we shouldn't be seeing both explicit instruction and decoding and all the foundational skills alongside high quality conversations with high quality literature, with really good read alouds. Another space where I think we likely could do a better job during read aloud time. We do that in K-3 often, sometimes twice a day, but we may not be utilizing that time in a way that does build vocabulary, oral language, and background knowledge. So I think thinking about how we can do the knowledge building also explicitly and systematically, that might seem a little bit odd to talk about it that way, but I think it's important to think about those things happening in tandem with sort of this really critical foundational skills.
Yeah, it remains a challenge for the field, right? I mean, I think about these programs and how they get used. I told Sharon I wasn't going to insert my opinion at all in this discussion, and I am doing that now. But it does seem like a very significant challenge for educators to make sense of these different programs and how they can strategically use them together to make sure that instruction, all the different areas of focus and the type of instruction students need is happening in the context of Tier 1 and in our intervention groups.
Well, and I just want to really acknowledge the work that Hank and Nancy have done getting the field to think about how important it is that as we organize instruction for Tier 1 and intervention, that we have some alignment so that we don't have students in Tier 2 learning things in different ways and in a different sequence than they're learning in Tier 1, and put the burden on the student to put it all together. It seems so apparent, but I really think it was their work that kind of woke people up to that. I don't know how awakened they are, but I would like for them to be.
Thank you, Sharon. Yes, we would like that. We would like for that to happen too. It's just about time to turn it over to questions that might be in the Q&A coming from folks. I know that our NCIL team has been answering some questions behind the scenes and may have some that have not yet been answered. Before we go to those questions, the one thing that we haven't talked about that I think we wanted to is just touching on diverse learners and thinking about English learners, and how either the findings from the meta-analysis extend to them or from your other work, and just comments related to best serving all of our students in school settings.
I can start, but I think everyone on this panel has done work with English learners, in particular Spanish-speaking English learners. So, what we know is that these explicit and systematic approaches that work for monolingual English speakers are also effective in teaching decoding for English learners. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be implementing the same strategies and instructional protocols with them. And we also know that we have work to do on the oral language development side for in vocabulary development in English for English learners or bilingual learners, and that over time, the relationship between the decoding side and language comprehension or linguistic comprehension is a little bit different for kids who are English learners, with the linguistic comprehension side perhaps being more important over time. And that of course makes sense, because these folks, these kids by definition are learning English while they're also learning how to read. And that's really very complex. But we shouldn't shy away from explicit and systematic instruction in the same way that we're doing decoding instruction and PA instruction and fluency for our English monolingual kids.
And I just wanted to add that, so Emily led a paper that was published recently in Learning Disabilities Research and Practice. Sharon was the guest editor of that special issue. And so it was a meta-analysis focused on English learners with word reading difficulties. I think we use a slightly broader definition of dyslexia. Maybe I don't fully remember than we did in the Reading Research Quarterly meta-analysis, but many people assume that when English learners or emergent bilingual students have reading difficulties, that the primary source of those reading difficulties is their difficulties with English language proficiency. But so I think it was a really important project to look at what research is out there for this group of emergent bilingual students who have documented, word reading difficulties, in addition to having, to still learning the English language. And I think it was important that I have confessed that I did not reread this paper before joining this webinar, but I believe that the mean effect was pretty similar of included interventions to the mean effect that we reported in the, meta-analysis in Reading Research Quarterly. And I think that, many of the interventions, again, were multi-component interventions. They included a word reading component, and they used an explicit systematic approach to building those foundational skills. So it's important to note that, it appears that what works for students who are not emergent bilingual students with word reading difficulties also works for students who are emergent bilingual students with word reading difficulties. Clearly, there's also a need to sort of especially focus on building language comprehension skills as well. But I thought that was worth pointing out. There's also a need for more research.
That was the other thing. There's just not many. There's not a lot of good studies out there, and so our number of studies, we had fewer studies than that were included in the study that Colby led.
Great. So those of you who are listening, who are looking for areas of research to focus on, you've gotten some good ideas, I think, from our panelists today. Sarah and Kristen, I don't know if you want to share questions from the audience for our panelists to respond to.
Sure. So there was a lot of interest in this finding around one-on-one being not more effective than small group instruction. So there's multiple questions asked related to this finding. First, there was just an interest in how is small group defined? How are you defining small group, or how were researchers defining them?
This is a good question, and I may need to dig into the paper because I don't have it written in my notes. But I do think that in general, the small groups were 3 to 5-ish. But I should check. And Sharon is Sharon has done work previously on this topic, so she is a good person to answer this question, not only based on data in our meta-analysis, but on her previous work as well.
Just a couple of clarifications. Usually the group sizes are, like Colby says, like 3 to 5. And the second thing that's really important is very few studies actually test directly group size. So test one-on-one instruction compared to smaller group 3 to 5. What this and other meta-analyses can do is tell you in separate studies whether those that did one-on-one instruction had greater or lesser impact than those that did group instruction. But we really haven't tested that directly, and I think it needs to be. The second thing is that finding is very consistent. This isn't the first meta-analysis that reports that. If you have group sizes that are 3 or 4, and of course, in the hands of a well-trained person who really understands how to pace accordingly, explicit and systematic instruction, small groups instruction can be effective. And if you're comparing, one-on-one with 1-on-4, it's literally 75% cheaper to, or it costs 4 times more to have one-on-one is another way to think about it. So, it is a question of economy. I don't think any of us would say, oh, if you have endless amount of money, would you rather teach 1-on-1 or 1-on-2, or would you rather teach 1-on-4? Well, we all know the answer to that. But when you don't have endless amounts of money and too many kids that need intervention, it is a comfort to know that you don't necessarily sacrifice.
Excellent points.
Karen, you hit on another point that somebody was inquiring about in the Q&A about what happens during that instruction. So if you're looking at one-on-one versus small group, to what degree does the features of high quality instruction matter versus if you're not seeing those features being implemented? And if we know that, if the research can even tell us that.
I think so. Just to add on, I found in the meta-analysis that the mean group size was about 4. So I do think 3 to 5 is a good definition for small group. And then I think I had another answer to this other question, but I'm losing my train of thought.
I mean, in the question, in the comments, it's, it's trying to get at this idea that what happens during instruction matters a lot, right? So group size is one way that we increase the intensity of instruction by decreasing group size, but we also increase the intensity of instruction by maybe increasing the rate of responding that students have the opportunities for in the context of our group and small group instruction, whether it's 3 to 5 students or whether it's one-on-one. And so I think some of the questions are about those features, like, assuming all things are the same or maybe things are different, does group size matter in that context?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and it's not something that we could test in this meta-analysis. I will say one, big limitation is that there were things that were not described in included studies that we all are talking about now that we know are really important factors, like opportunities to respond. And that just wasn't something that was described in the included studies, so we couldn't code for it as a variable, and we couldn't look to see if it moderated intervention effects, right? I also think it's important to point out that questions like these are what makes multiple moderator analyses a really important approach, because you're right that certain variables co-vary. Like in a small group intervention, you may be more likely to use a certain approach or include certain intervention components. And so it's in this multiple moderator model, you can test for the effect of a certain moderator while controlling for the effects of other moderators that may covary with that one. But I don't know if I can answer that question except to say that it seems like a good hypothesis to me.
I think we have time for one final question. There was a question to the panel about what you would suggest a team do to build an intervention program that is consistent and integrated with the core curriculum. So any tips?
Nancy, this might be a one for you to answer.
No, I'll let you all talk about this.
You want to start, Colby? You can start.
I also feel like I know I keep asking other people to answer questions, but I really do think, Sharon, you also have done a lot of work on alignment recently, so you might be the best one to answer this question if you're up for it.
in a small scale, well, not that small, experimental study that Elizabeth Stevens, who's now at the University of Kansas, and myself did. We aligned the reading comprehension instruction in an intervention with the same kind of reading comprehension instruction in Tier 1. So the language was the same and the functional strategies were the same, and they were taught the same, with the idea that if you use the same language and the same approach, and students get to practice in multiple settings across multiple text genres, we hypothesized it would be associated with even greater reading comprehension. And we contrasted that with the intervention only, so students that got it only in intervention, but not in Tier 1. And then the third contrast, as a 3-arm experimental study, was a business as usual condition. And the aligned condition for reading comprehension was statistically significantly more impactful than the intervention condition alone. And both of those conditions were more impactful than the business as usual condition. But the effect sizes for the alignment were significantly higher. So I think it's just, it's an idea whose time has come. And I think it's something we kind of have the right and responsibility to be responsive to.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments so much. I think, the work that Sharon referenced earlier that Hank and I have engaged in, we have focused on the implementation of an aligned systemic intervention for Tier 1 and Tier 2 that focuses more heavily on foundational reading skills in Tier 2, and that is delivered as a pre-teach for students who then see the same content with the same formats and the same language in Tier 1, and have found that that's effective, but we haven't been able to disentangle the effects of alignment as compared to other features of the systemic intervention. So additional directions for us for future research. Sarah, do you want to close us out?
Yes. So I want to thank the UWELAC for hosting this event, our panelists for sharing their perspectives and experience, and our attendees for participating today. We hope you join us for future Reading the Room events. You will receive a recording of today's event and it will be posted on the NCIL website. A brief feedback form for the event will automatically launch in your web browser when you leave the webinar, and we kindly ask for you to complete it then. To stay abreast of the latest NCIL news and information, please follow us on Facebook or on Twitter. Sign up for our newsletter at improvingliteracy.org. Thank you again for joining us for our 5th Reading the Room event in our series and your interest in promoting evidence-based literacy practices. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.